Police harassed a black teacher in front of kids. What the students did next shocked everyone. Jamal Hayes pulled into the Central Middle School parking lot at exactly 7:15 a.m., just like he did every Monday morning. His old Honda Civic made that familiar clicking sound as the engine cooled down, and he grabbed his worn leather messenger bag from the passenger seat. The bag was stuffed with papers he'd graded over the weekend, complete with his trademark encouraging notes in green ink. He never used red, thinking it looked too harsh on student papers. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. The morning air had that crisp feel that made everything seem possible. A few early birds, mostly teachers and the occasional eager student, were already making their way across the parking lot. Jamal waved to Mrs. Chun, the math teacher who always arrived even earlier than him, and she returned his greeting with a sleepy smile. Inside his classroom, Jamal flicked on the lights and smiled at the sight of student projects lining the walls. Their latest assignment had been to create timelines of significant civil rights events, and his kids had really outdone themselves. Some had used photographs, others had drawn incredible illustrations, and a few had even incorporated QR codes linking to video clips they'd found particularly moving. He set his bag down on his desk and pulled out his laptop, checking the day's lesson plan one more time. Today they'd be diving into a particularly important chapter of civil rights history, and he wanted to make sure he got it just right. His students deserved nothing less than his absolute best. The clock on the wall showed 7:30 as he began writing the day's agenda on the whiteboard. His handwriting was neat and precise, another small detail he took pride in. Students deserve to clearly see what they're learning, he always said. Below the agenda, he wrote the day's discussion question. How do small acts of courage change the world? More teachers and students started filing into the building now. The hallways filled with the usual morning chaos, lockers slamming, friends catching up about their weekends, and the occasional reminder from teachers about no running in the halls. Jamal could hear it all through his classroom door, and it made him smile. These everyday sounds were the soundtrack to his life's work. A knock on his door frame caught his attention. "Morning, Mr. Hayes." It was Deshaun, one of his 8th graders who often came in early to talk about history, or just life in general. "Hey there, Deshaun. How was your weekend?" Jamal asked, genuinely interested. He noticed the boy was carrying a thick book under his arm, something that definitely wasn't assigned reading. "Pretty good. I went to the library like you suggested and found this book about the Freedom Riders. I'm already halfway through it." Deshaun's eyes lit up as he talked about what he'd learned so far. Jamal felt that familiar warmth in his chest, the feeling that reminded him why he became a teacher in the first place. These moments, when a student discovered their own passion for learning, made everything worthwhile. He and Deshaun spent the next 15 minutes discussing the book, with Jamal carefully drawing connections between the historical events and present-day situations his student could relate to. More students began trickling in as the first bell approached. Each one got a personal greeting from Jamal. He made sure of that. "Morning, Sophia. Did you finish that science project you were worried about?" "Hey, Marcus. How'd your sister's recital go?" Small connections, but they mattered. Every student who walked through his door needed to know they were seen and valued. Maya, one of his most engaged students, came in with her usual enthusiasm, already pulling out her notebook and color-coded pens. She had a way of getting other students excited about learning, and Jamal often thought she might end up being a teacher herself someday. "Mr. Hayes, I watched that documentary you recommended about the Montgomery bus boycott. Can we talk about it during lunch?" "Absolutely, Maya. I'd love to hear your thoughts," he replied, checking the clock again. 5 minutes until the bell. He could feel the energy building in the room, that special kind of anticipation that came with knowing today's lesson would be something important. The final bell rang, and Jamal closed the classroom door, ready to start the day. 28 faces looked back at him, some eager, some still sleepy, but all familiar. He'd spent months getting to know each of these kids, their struggles, their dreams, their favorite lunch foods. Teaching history wasn't just about dates and events. It was about helping these young people understand their place in the ongoing story of humanity. "Good morning, everyone," he started, moving to the center of the room. He never taught from behind his desk. That created too much distance between him and his students. Before we dive into today's lesson, who wants to share something good that happened over the weekend? Several hands shot up, and Jamal called on them one by one. Carlos talked about his little sister's first steps. Jessica beamed about winning her soccer game. Tyler shyly mentioned finishing his first comic book. Jamal listened to each story with genuine interest, adding encouraging comments and asking follow-up questions. These morning check-ins might not be in the official curriculum, but they built the trust and connection that made real learning possible. As the sharing wrapped up, Jamal gestured to the question he'd written on the board earlier. How do small acts of courage change the world? He let the question hang in the air for a moment. Today, we're going to talk about ordinary people who did extraordinary things. People who woke up one morning, went about their normal day, and then faced a moment where they had to make a choice. He pulled up a PowerPoint slide showing a lunch counter sit-in. The black and white image showed young people, not much older than his students, sitting quietly while angry faces shouted at them. "Look at their faces," he said softly. "What do you see?" "They look scared," someone offered. "But they're staying there anyway," another voice added. "Exactly," Jamal nodded. They were terrified, but they knew what they were doing was right, so they found the courage to stay. Sometimes that's all it takes, just staying when everything in you wants to run. The discussion flowed naturally from there. Jamal moved around the room, calling on raised hands, gently encouraging quieter students to share their thoughts. He had a knack for making connections that helped his students relate to historical events. When Marcus mentioned feeling nervous about standing up to a bully, Jamal helped the class see how that same kind of courage played out in larger social movements. Time flew by as they explored different examples of everyday courage. Jamal shared stories about young people their age who had changed history. Ruby Bridges walking into school, the Little Rock Nine, the Birmingham Children's Crusade. His students leaned forward in their seats, caught up in these tales of young people who had faced down hatred with dignity and determination. "But Mr. Hayes," piped up Rachel from the back row, "didn't they get in trouble for breaking the rules?" "That's a great question," Jamal replied, seeing an opportunity to dig deeper. Sometimes rules aren't fair. Sometimes doing what's right means questioning authority. The trick is knowing the difference between breaking rules just because you don't like them and standing up against rules that hurt people. He glanced at the clock, still 30 minutes left in the period. Perfect timing to start their activity. "Okay, let's try something. I want you all to imagine you're living in 1960. You're at a lunch counter that doesn't serve people of color. What would you do? What would it feel like to be there? What might you be risking?" The students broke into small groups, their voices animated as they discussed different scenarios. Jamal moved between the groups, listening, asking questions, helping them think through the real-world implications of their choices. He heard them wrestling with tough questions. Would their parents be proud or angry? Would they lose friends? Would it be worth it? As he listened to their discussions, Jamal felt that familiar mix of hope and responsibility settle over him. These kids got it. They understood that history wasn't just a collection of facts to memorize, it was a guide for how to live, how to make choices, how to be human in a complicated world. The period was almost over, but Jamal had one more thing to share. He pulled up a final slide showing a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." Think about this quote tonight, he told his class as they started packing up their things. Tomorrow, we'll talk about how it applies to our own lives. And remember, you're never too young to stand up for what's right. The bell rang, and his students filed out, still chatting about the lesson. Jamal began preparing for his next class, unaware that very soon, his students would have a chance to put these lessons into practice in a way none of them could have expected. As he erased the board and wrote up the next period's agenda, he had no idea that his ordinary Monday was about to become anything but ordinary. The second period was in full swing when the knock came. It wasn't the usual quick tap of a student arriving late or the rhythmic pattern of the principal's check-ins. This knock was heavy, authoritative, demanding attention. Jamal paused mid-sentence, chalk still pressed against the board where he'd been mapping out the timeline of the Montgomery bus boycott. The students noticed his hesitation. Maya, sitting in the front row, watched as something flickered across Mr. Hayes's face. Confusion, maybe concern. He set down the chalk, brushed the dust from his hands onto his dark slacks, and walked to the door with measured steps. When he opened it, the fluorescent hallway lights seemed to dim against the presence of 2 police officers. They filled the doorframe, their badges catching the light, hands resting near their belts in what they probably thought was a casual stance. The taller one spoke first, his voice carrying into the suddenly silent classroom. "Are you Jamal Hayes?" "Yes, I am. I'm in the middle of teaching. Is there something I can help you with?" Jamal's voice was steady, professional, but his students could hear the tension beneath his words. "We need you to step outside for a moment." The shorter officer's hand moved to guide Jamal into the hallway, but Jamal took a step back, maintaining his space. "Could you tell me what this is about?" "As I mentioned, I'm teaching right now." Jamal gestured toward his class, where 28 pairs of eyes watched with growing concern. The officers exchanged glances. "We received a complaint about a suspicious individual in the school. We need to verify your identity and purpose here." A soft gasp came from somewhere in the classroom. Jamal felt his chest tighten, but his face remained composed. Years of experience had taught him how to wear a mask of calm even when his insides were churning. "I'm a teacher here. I've been teaching at Central Middle School for 5 years. He reached slowly toward his desk. "My ID badge is right there." "Sir, step into the hallway now." The taller officer's tone hardened, his hand shifting slightly toward his belt. Jamal could feel the energy in the classroom shift. His students were no longer just watching, they were witnessing. Everything he taught them about justice and injustice was playing out right in front of them. He thought about all the historical figures they discussed, all the moments when ordinary people had to decide how to react to unfair treatment. "Of course," he said quietly. "Students, please continue reading pages 142 to 145 while I step out for a moment." But as he moved into the hallway, he could see his students exchanging looks, some pulling out their phones, others standing up from their desks. Maya had that determined set to her jaw that he recognized from class discussions about civil rights, the look that said she wasn't going to stay quiet. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the officers positioned themselves on either side of him. Other teachers began peering out of their classrooms, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen stepped fully into the hallway, her face a mix of concern and indignation. What exactly was the nature of this complaint? Jamal asked, keeping his voice level despite the humiliation of being questioned in front of his colleagues and students. "We received a call about an unauthorized adult in the school building," the shorter officer replied, pulling out a notepad. "Can you explain your presence here today?" Jamal took a deep breath. "As I said, I'm a teacher. I've been teaching here for 5 years. My classroom is right here." He gestured to the door behind him, where faces were now pressed against the window. "My ID badge is on my desk. The principal, Ms. Rodriguez, can verify my employment. And you have documentation to prove your identity?" The taller officer's tone suggested this was more accusation than question. Through the classroom window, Jamal could see his students' faces, their expressions shifting from confusion to anger. He had just been teaching them about standing up to injustice, about recognizing when something was wrong, and having the courage to speak up. Now they were watching their teacher being treated like a criminal in their own school hallway. The situation in the hallway was getting worse. More students had gathered at their classroom doors, whispering and pointing. The officers' questions became increasingly aggressive, their stance more threatening. Jamal could feel sweat forming at the back of his neck, but he kept his voice steady, his movements slow and deliberate. "My wallet is in my back pocket," he said carefully. "I'm going to reach for it now." "Keep your hands where we can see them," the taller officer barked, causing several nearby students to jump. "We'll need you to come down to the station to verify your identity properly." Mrs. Chun had pulled out her phone and was frantically typing, probably messaging the principal. Another teacher, Mr. Thompson from the science department, had stepped into the hallway, moving closer to show support. Inside Jamal's classroom, the tension was building. Maya had pulled her chair closer to the door, straining to hear every word. She remembered Mr. Hayes' lessons about the power of peaceful resistance, about how silence in the face of injustice was the same as accepting it. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. "This doesn't feel right," she whispered to Carlos, who sat next to her. "They're treating him like he did something wrong." "But they're cops," Carlos whispered back, though his face showed he was struggling with the same thoughts. What are we supposed to do? The officers were now demanding that Jamal accompany them to their patrol car. Their voices carried clearly through the door, each word making the students more restless. They could hear the strain in their teacher's voice as he tried to remain professional while being treated like a criminal. "I have classes to teach," Jamal was saying. "If you'll just allow me to show you my ID, or we can walk to the main office where the principal can verify." "Sir, you're being uncooperative," the shorter officer cut in. "This can go one of two ways." That was when Maya stood up. She wasn't alone. Around the classroom, other students were rising from their seats too. They had spent weeks studying civil rights, learning about people who stood up when they saw something wrong. Mr. Hayes had taught them that history wasn't just something that happened in the past, it was something people made happen through their choices. Through the window, they could see their teacher being backed against the wall. The officer's body language was aggressive, their hands hovering near their weapons. It didn't matter that this was happening in a school hallway, that Jamal was dressed in his usual button-down shirt and tie, that student artwork covered the walls behind him. All that mattered was that someone had looked at him and decided he didn't belong. "We have to do something," Maya said, her voice stronger now. She looked around at her classmates, seeing the same determination in their faces. They had just been learning about sit-ins, about young people who had faced down hatred with dignity and courage. The first students moved toward the door just as one of the officers grabbed Jamal's arm. The touch wasn't gentle, and Jamal's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the classroom door. That sound, their teacher's pain and humiliation, broke something loose in the students. Maya reached for the door handle, her heart pounding but her mind clear. Behind her, she could feel her classmates moving forward, united in purpose. They had studied history, but now they were about to make it. Their teacher had always told them that change happened when ordinary people decided they couldn't stay silent anymore. Outside in the hallway, the officers were still focused on Jamal, their backs to the classroom door. They didn't notice the door opening, didn't hear the first student stepping out. It wasn't until Maya's voice rang out, clear and strong, that they realized something had changed. The hallway had become crowded with students from other classes too, drawn by the commotion. They formed a semicircle around the scene, phones recording, faces showing a mix of fear and determination. The officers looked around, suddenly aware that their audience had grown, that what had started as a simple questioning was becoming something else entirely. Jamal watched his students file out of the classroom, his heart swelling with pride even as fear gripped him. He wanted to tell them to go back inside, to stay safe, but the words wouldn't come. They moved with purpose, with the dignity he had taught them about, their faces showing they understood exactly what they were doing. The school hallway had become a stage where history was playing out in real time. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the clock on the wall ticked forward, and in that ordinary middle school hallway, extraordinary courage was about to change everything. Maya took the first step forward, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice surprisingly steady. "Mr. Hayes is our teacher," she announced, looking directly at the officers. Other students moved with her, forming a protective semicircle around their teacher. The officers' expressions shifted from stern authority to uncertainty as they faced this unexpected resistance. "Return to your classroom immediately," the taller officer commanded, but his voice carried a note of hesitation now. These weren't the usual bystanders they dealt with. These were kids, students in their own school, standing together with unmistakable purpose. "We're not going anywhere," Carlos said, stepping up beside Maya. His voice shook slightly, but he stood tall. "You're treating Mr. Hayes wrong, and we're not going to let it happen." More students pushed forward from other classrooms, drawn by the commotion and their own sense of right and wrong. The hallway filled with whispers and the soft clicks of phone cameras. Everyone knew this moment mattered, that something important was happening right here in their ordinary school hallway. "Mr. Hayes taught us about the Children's Crusade," Jessica called out from the growing crowd. "He taught us that kids can make a difference when adults are being unfair." The shorter officer took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "This is a police matter," You need to return to your classrooms now." But the students held their ground. They had formed a human barrier between the officers and their teacher, their bodies trembling with fear but their faces set with determination. They'd learned about moments like this in class, moments when ordinary people had to choose between what was easy and what was right. Jamal watched his students with a mixture of pride and terror. Everything he'd taught them about civil rights and standing up for justice was playing out right in front of him, but now he feared for their safety. "Students," he started, trying to keep his voice calm, "I appreciate what you're doing, but—" "No, Mr. Hayes," Maya cut in, her voice stronger now. "You taught us that silence helps the oppressor, never the oppressed. You showed us pictures of kids our age standing up to fire hoses and police dogs. We're not going anywhere." The crowd in the hallway had grown larger. Teachers stood at their doorways, many with phones raised, recording everything. Mrs. Chun had positioned herself near the group, her presence a silent support for the students' protest. Mr. Thompson moved closer too, standing where he could intervene if needed. "Listen to me," the taller officer said, his hand still hovering near his belt. "You're interfering with the police investigation. This could have serious consequences." "We're practicing peaceful protest," another student called out. "It's our First Amendment right. Mr. Hayes taught us that too." The students began quoting from their lessons, their voices gaining strength as they spoke words they'd studied but never had to use before. They talked about civil disobedience, about the power of peaceful resistance, about standing up to injustice. Each voice added to the chorus, transforming the school hallway into something more, a place where history was happening in real time. Some students had started live streaming the incident. Others were texting their parents, spreading the word beyond the school walls. The officers looked increasingly uncomfortable as they realized this situation was spiraling beyond their control. "My mom's on the school board," one student announced. "She's on her way here right now." Another chimed in. "My dad's a lawyer. He says what you're doing is profiling and it's illegal." The students had created more than just a physical barrier. They'd created a moment of moral clarity that was impossible to ignore. Their phones captured everything: the officers' aggressive stance, their teachers' dignified composure, the united front of young people refusing to accept injustice in their school. Maya stepped forward again, her voice carrying down the hallway. "We've been learning about civil rights all semester. Mr. Hayes taught us that change happens when people stand together against injustice. That's what we're doing right now." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Other students nodded, their faces showing they understood exactly what this moment meant. They weren't just standing up for their teacher. They were standing up for everything he had taught them about justice, courage, and doing what's right. Through it all, Jamal remained still, watching his students transform from passive learners to active participants in the very history they'd been studying. Every fact they quoted, every principle they stood for, these were things they'd discussed in class, but now they were living them. The atmosphere in the hallway had shifted. What started as a confrontation was becoming something else, a lesson in civic action, in collective courage, in the power of young voices raised in unity. The officers found themselves facing not just a group of middle school students, but the very principles of justice and civil rights those students had been taught to defend. Some of the younger students had started singing, quietly at first, then with growing confidence. It was "We Shall Overcome," a song they'd learned in Mr. Hayes' class when studying the civil rights movement. The melody filled the hallway, turning their protest into something both powerful and peaceful. Parents had started arriving, drawn by their children's urgent texts and calls. They pushed through the school entrance, adding their adult voices to the chorus of protest. The situation had grown far beyond what anyone had expected, transforming from a simple police questioning into a moment of community action. Through it all, the students maintained their position, their bodies forming a living barrier between their teacher and those who would harm him. They were scared, their trembling hands and shaking voices showed that, but they were also brave in a way that only people fighting for what's right can be. The officers looked at each other, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. They could hear sirens in the distance, probably more police responding to their call for backup, but they could also hear the growing crowd of parents and community members gathering outside the school. In that moment, Standing in their school hallway surrounded by students who refused to be silent in the face of injustice, everyone present knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. They were living the very history they had been studying, turning textbook lessons into real-world action. The air was electric with possibility and purpose. The students' fear had transformed into determination, their individual voices joining into one powerful statement against injustice. They had crossed a line they could never uncross, stepping from the safety of their classroom into the uncertain territory of active resistance. Principal Rodriguez's heels clicked sharply against the linoleum floor as she strode down the hallway, her face a mask of controlled concern. The crowd of students parted to let her through, their singing fading to expectant silence. She took in the scene with one sweeping glance, her students forming a protective circle, the officer's uncomfortable stance, Jamal's dignified composure despite the situation. "I'm Gloria Rodriguez, the principal of Central Middle School," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of authority without aggression. "I understand there's been some confusion about Mr. Hayes' presence in our school." The taller officer straightened up, trying to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about a suspicious individual." "The only suspicious activity I see," Principal Rodriguez cut in smoothly, "is the harassment of one of my most respected teachers in front of his students." She pulled out her phone, showing them something on the screen. "I have here Mr. Hayes' complete employment record, background check, and teaching credentials. I've also just gotten off the phone with Superintendent Williams, who is, as you can imagine, very interested in this situation." The atmosphere in the hallway shifted. The students remained steady in their protective formation, but you could feel the tension starting to ease. Maya caught Mr. Hayes' eye and saw the smallest nod of appreciation, though his face remained serious. "We were just following protocol," the shorter officer began, but his words sounded hollow in the face of such united opposition. Parents were still arriving, their presence adding pressure to the situation. Someone had contacted local news stations, and reporters were gathering outside the school gates. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her phone still recording. "I have the entire incident on video," she said quietly, including the part where these officers refused to let Mr. Hayes show his ID and threatened to arrest him for teaching his class. The officers exchanged glances, finally seeming to understand the gravity of their mistake. The hallway had become crowded with witnesses, students, teachers, parents, all standing together against what they knew was wrong. Phone cameras captured everything, ensuring this moment wouldn't be forgotten or misrepresented. Principal Rodriguez moved to stand beside Jamal, her presence both protective and professional. "Mr. Hayes has been teaching at Central Middle School for 5 years. He's earned Teacher of the Year twice. His students consistently show the highest improvement rates in social studies across the district. But more importantly, he's a valued member of our school community who deserves to be treated with respect." The students stayed quiet, but their faces showed pride in their principal's words. They knew Mr. Hayes was special not just as a teacher, but as someone who lived the values he taught them about. Now they watched as the adult world began to recognize what they had known all along. One of the parents who had arrived, a local attorney, stepped forward. "I'd like to know who made this complaint and on what grounds. This looks like a clear case of racial profiling, and I'm sure the school board and the media would be very interested in how it was handled." The taller officer's radio crackled with a message from dispatch. After listening, his posture changed noticeably. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," he said, trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. "We'll need to file a report about the incident." "Yes, we will," Principal Rodriguez agreed firmly. "My office has already started documenting everything. I'm sure your superiors will want to review how a simple ID check turned into a confrontation with middle school students." Some of the younger students had started to shake now that the immediate danger was passing, the adrenaline wearing off. Their classmates put arms around them, offering silent support. They had stood their ground together, and they would comfort each other too. Maya spoke up again, her voice clear in the tense atmosphere. "We learned about something called moral courage in Mr. Hayes' class. It means doing what's right even when you're scared. That's what we did today." Her words seemed to touch something in everyone present. The officer's remaining authority seemed to deflate, replaced by what looked like shame. They had come expecting to find a suspicious character, only to discover they were the ones whose behavior was being questioned. Parents had begun recording statements from students who had witnessed everything from the beginning. Teachers compared their videos, making sure every angle of the incident was documented. The school counselor moved through the crowd, checking on students who seemed particularly shaken. Through it all, Jamal remained composed, though those who knew him well could see the emotion in his eyes. He watched his students, these young people who had taken his lessons about justice and turned them into action. They had risen to a challenge he had never wanted them to face, showing courage he had hoped they would never need. "I think we're done here," Principal Rodriguez said to the officers, her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "I trust you can find your way out. We have classes to return to." The officers backed away, their earlier aggression replaced by awkward retreat. They moved through the crowd, followed by the steady gaze of students who had learned more about justice in the last hour than any textbook could teach them. As the officers disappeared down the hallway, a subtle change went through the crowd. Shoulders relaxed, breathing eased, but the sense of unity remained. They had faced something together, and that experience had transformed them. The hallway was still full of people, but now they weren't protesters. They were witnesses to something extraordinary. Principal Rodriguez turned to address the crowd, her voice gentle but firm. "I am incredibly proud of every one of you," she said. "You showed remarkable courage and dignity. But now we need to help each other process what happened here. The counselor's office will be open all day for anyone who needs to talk." The officers' retreat left a strange quiet in the hallway. Students and teachers stood together, the adrenaline slowly fading from their systems, replaced by a mix of relief and lingering tension. Principal Rodriguez was still talking with some parents near the main office, their voices low but intense. The sound of news vans pulling up outside filtered through the windows. Jamal looked at his students, these amazing young people who had just done something extraordinary. His hands were shaking slightly as he lowered them to his sides, no longer needing to maintain that careful, non-threatening posture he'd held for what felt like hours. Maya was the first to move, stepping forward to hug him. That broke the spell, and suddenly he was surrounded by students, all trying to check if he was okay. "Mr. Hayes," Maya said, her voice wobbling slightly, "we just did what you taught us, about standing up when something's wrong." "You did more than that," Jamal replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed more courage than anyone should have to show in their own school." He looked around at their faces, some tear-stained, others still flushed with excitement, all showing a new kind of awareness that hadn't been there this morning. Mrs. Chin approached with a tissue box, offering it to some of the crying students. "I've already sent the videos to Principal Rodriguez," she said quietly to Jamal. "And to my husband, he's a civil rights attorney." Parents were gathering their children, some leaving for the day, others staying to talk with administrators. The hallway slowly cleared, but nobody rushed. They moved like people waking from a shared dream, reluctant to break the bonds this experience had forged. Back in his classroom, Jamal's students refused to return to their regular seats. They pulled their chairs into a circle, something they usually did for important discussions. Nobody mentioned the worksheet they were supposed to be doing. Some things were more important than the planned curriculum. "I need to say something," Jamal began, looking around the circle at these faces he knew so well. "What happened today, what was done to me, it wasn't right. But what you did," he paused, gathering himself. "That was incredible. And incredibly brave. And I need you to understand something. That kind of brave is dangerous." Carlos raised his hand, then spoke without waiting to be called on. The old rules seemed less important now. "We weren't going to let them hurt you, Mr. Hayes. We couldn't." "I know," Jamal said softly. "But I'm the teacher. I'm supposed to protect you, not the other way around." "You do protect us," Maya insisted. "You protect us by teaching us the truth, by showing us how to stand up for what's right. Today we just got to show you that we were listening." Other students nodded, and someone in the back of the room started crying quietly. The emotion in the room was palpable, pride mixed with lingering fear, the realization of what they'd done tangled up with the understanding of what could have happened. Principal Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, knocking gently on the frame. "Mr. Hayes, the superintendent is here, and there are some reporters outside who'd like to talk to us." She looked around the room at the students. "Your parents have been called. Anyone who needs to go home can. But if you want to stay..." She left the choice open. Not a single student moved to leave. They looked at each other, then at Mr. Hayes, their faces showing the same determination they'd shown in the hallway. This wasn't over yet, and they knew it. "We're staying," Maya said firmly. "We're part of this too." Jamal felt that surge of pride again, stronger now. These weren't just his students anymore. They had become something more, witnesses, participants, champions of justice in their own right. They had taken everything he taught them about civil rights and moral courage and turned it into action. The superintendent arrived with the school board president, both looking grave but supportive. They pulled chairs into the circle too, somehow understanding that this moment called for equality rather than hierarchy. The reporters would have to wait. "Tell us what happened," the superintendent said, not to Jamal but to the students. "In your own words." And so they did. One by one, they described what they'd seen, what they'd felt, what had made them decide to act. They spoke about Mr. Hayes' lessons on civil rights, about how he had taught them to recognize injustice and stand against it. They talked about being scared but doing it anyway, about knowing it was right even though it was hard. As Jamal listened to his students speak, he realized something profound had shifted. The trauma of being confronted by police in his own classroom was still there, a wound that would take time to heal. But wrapped around that pain was something powerful, the knowledge that his teaching had not just filled minds but had shaped characters, had not just conveyed information but had built conviction. Parents began arriving, but instead of taking their children home, many joined the circle. The classroom grew crowded, but no one seemed to mind. They were all part of this now. This moment of reckoning and recognition, of pain and pride intertwined. A local news crew peeked through the window, but Principal Rodriguez shooed them away. This wasn't a story for the evening news, not yet. This was a moment for this community to process what had happened, to hold space for both the triumph and the tragedy of needing such courage in a place of learning. The afternoon light slanted through the classroom windows, casting long shadows across faces that looked somehow older than they had this morning. They had all changed today, students, teachers, parents, administrators. They had seen both the worst and the best of what people could do, and they would carry that knowledge forward. As the day wound down and most students finally headed home, Jamal stayed in his classroom with a smaller group who refused to leave. Maya, Carlos, and a handful of others sat quietly, processing everything that had happened. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desks, and the usual after-school sounds, slamming lockers, chattering voices, squeaking sneakers, seemed muted, as if the whole school was still holding its breath. "Mr. Hayes," Maya broke the silence, her voice small but steady, "are you really okay?" Jamal looked at his students, considering how honest he should be. These kids had shown incredible maturity today. They deserved the truth. He pulled his chair closer to their circle and took a deep breath. "No," he admitted quietly. "I'm not okay. What happened today, it hurt. Not physically, but..." He gestured vaguely toward his chest. "It hurts to be judged like that, to be seen as dangerous just because of how I look. Especially here, in our school, where I've taught for years." Carlos shifted in his seat. "My dad says that happens to him sometimes too. People following him around stores, security guards asking what he's doing in nice neighborhoods." His voice cracked slightly. "I always thought he was maybe exaggerating, you know? But today you saw it happen." Jamal finished for him. "And that's part of why I'm not okay. Because you all had to see this ugly thing that exists in our world. You had to grow up a little faster than you should have had to." The room fell quiet again. Outside, a news V and was pulling away from the school, its satellite dish folding down. The story would be on the evening news, but it wouldn't capture this, the real cost of standing up, the quiet pain in the aftermath. "But you know what else?" Jamal continued, looking at each of their faces. "I'm also proud. So incredibly proud it almost makes up for the hurt. Because today you all showed me something amazing. You showed me that everything we've been learning about All those discussions about justice and courage and standing up for what's right, they weren't just words to you. Maya wiped her eyes with her sleeve. We were scared, she admitted. Really scared. But you always taught us that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the right thing even when you're terrified. That's exactly right, Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. But I need you all to understand something important. What you did today was incredible, but it was also risky. Those officers, they could have reacted differently. Things could have gone very wrong. We know, Carlos said quietly, but we couldn't just watch. It wasn't right. A knock on the door frame made them all jump slightly. It was Principal Rodriguez, looking tired but determined. Sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Hayes, the superintendent wants to meet with us first thing tomorrow morning. And she hesitated. There's going to be a press conference. The police chief wants to make a statement. The students straightened in their chairs, protective instincts flaring again. We'll be there too, Maya declared. Maya, Jamal started. No, Mr. Hayes. We're part of this. All of us. She looked around at her classmates, who nodded in agreement. You taught us about being witnesses to history. Well, we're not just witnesses anymore. We're part of it. Principal Rodriguez smiled slightly. Actually, we were hoping some students would be willing to speak at the press conference. With parent permission, of course. The weight of that request settled over the room. Speaking up in the heat of the moment was one thing. Choosing to stand up and speak publicly about it was another. But looking at their faces, Jamal could see they understood the importance of their story. Before you decide, he said carefully, you need to know something. Speaking up about this, it might make some people angry. There are people who won't want to hear about what happened today. They might say mean things, might try to make you feel bad about what you did. Like when people attacked the Little Rock Nine? Carlos asked. Or Ruby Bridges? Yes, Jamal nodded, pain and pride mixing in his chest. Standing up for what's right sometimes comes with a cost. That's something we've talked about in class, but now you're living it. But isn't that exactly why we have to speak up? Maya looked around at her classmates. If we stay quiet, nothing changes. That's what you taught us, Mr. Hayes, about how silence helps the oppressor. Principal Rodriguez cleared her throat, her eyes suspiciously bright. I'll talk to your parents tonight. Anyone who wants to speak tomorrow should have their parents call me directly. After she left, the room fell quiet again. The students looked at their phones, checking social media, seeing their story already spreading. Videos of their protest were being shared, commented on, debated. Their small school hallway had become a battleground in a much larger fight. Mr. Hayes, one of the quieter students spoke up. Do you think what we did today will make a difference? Like, a real difference? Jamal looked at these young faces, these students who had turned his lessons into action, who had stood up when it mattered most. I think, he said carefully, that every big change starts with small moments of courage. What you did today, it might seem small in the grand scheme of things. But it's these moments, these choices to stand up instead of standing by, that eventually change the world. The sun was setting now, casting an orange glow across the classroom. Soon they would all have to go home, face their families, deal with the attention their actions had brought. But for now, they sat together in their circle, supporting each other, processing what they had done and what it might mean. One more thing, Jamal said, his voice gentle but serious. I want you all to talk to someone about what happened today. Your parents, the school counselor, me, someone. What you did was brave, but it was also scary. It's okay to feel shaken up. It's okay to not be okay. The next few days at Central Middle School felt different. The hallway where everything had happened became something of a landmark. Students walked through it more slowly, some touching the walls as if to connect with what had occurred there. Mr. Hayes' classroom was fuller than ever, with students from other classes finding excuses to stop by during breaks, as if checking to make sure he was still there, still okay. The press conference had gone better than anyone expected. Maya spoke with a clarity that surprised even herself, her voice steady as she explained to the cameras why they had acted. We learned about civil rights in Mr. Hayes' class, she'd said, looking directly into the lenses. But on Monday, we lived it. The police chief had issued a formal apology, promising an investigation and mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all officers. But it was the superintendent's announcement that made the biggest impact. The school district would be implementing new security protocols that prioritized protecting staff and students from harassment while maintaining actual safety. Jamal's first class after the incident was unlike any he'd taught before. His students filed in quietly, taking their seats but keeping their eyes on him, as if worried he might disappear. He stood at the front of the room, looking at these faces he knew so well, seeing how they'd changed in just a few days. "So," he said, managing a smile, "who's ready to talk about history?" A few nervous laughs broke the tension. Carlos raised his hand. "Mr. Hayes? Aren't we kind of living history right now?" That opened the floodgates. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk about what had happened, how it connected to everything they'd been learning. The planned lesson about the Montgomery bus boycott took on new meaning as students drew parallels to their own experience. "I never really got it before," Jessica admitted during the discussion. "Like, we learned about Rosa Parks and the bus boycott, but it felt so far away. Now I understand why she didn't want to move. Why it mattered so much to stand up, even for something that seems small to other people." Other teachers noticed changes in their students too. In English class, essays about moral courage became more personal, more urgent. Science discussions about hypothesis testing led to conversations about questioning authority and demanding evidence. Even math problems about statistics sparked debates about racial profiling and the importance of data in fighting discrimination. The school counselor's office was busier than usual. Students dropped in to process what they'd witnessed, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. Many talked about feeling different, more aware, more responsible, more connected to the bigger world outside school. Parents noticed changes at home too. Dinner conversations became deeper, more challenging. Kids who had never shown interest in current events were suddenly asking questions about justice systems and civil rights. Some families reported watching documentaries together, reading books about activism, having discussions that might have seemed too heavy just a week ago. Jamal noticed his teaching changing as well. His lessons became more immediate, more connected to current events. When he talked about historical figures who stood up against injustice, he could point to examples his students understood personally. Theory had become reality, and there was no going back. One morning, about a week after the incident, he arrived to find his students had rearranged the classroom. Instead of traditional rows, they'd placed the desks in a circle, like they'd sat that first afternoon while processing what had happened. No one had asked permission. They'd just done it, understanding somehow that their relationship to learning had fundamentally changed. "We thought it would be better this way," Maya explained when he raised an eyebrow at the new arrangement. "So we can all see each other when we talk. So nobody feels alone." The change wasn't just in his classroom. During lunch periods, students who had never interacted before sat together, talking about things that mattered. The cliques and social barriers that typically divided middle school seemed less important now. They had shared something profound, and it had connected them in ways that transcended the usual social boundaries. Teachers started noticing students being more vocal about smaller injustices too, speaking up when they saw bullying, questioning unfair rules, supporting classmates who felt marginalized. It wasn't always comfortable for the adults, but it was real and important. Mrs. Chen commented on it during a staff meeting. "They're different now," she said. "More aware, more willing to engage with difficult topics. It's like they've realized they have a voice, and they're not afraid to use it." Principal Rodriguez had noticed too. She started holding regular forums where students could voice concerns and suggest changes. The school student council, once focused mainly on planning dances and spirit weeks, began tackling more substantial issues. But it wasn't all serious discussions and heavy moments. There was joy too, the kind that comes from knowing you've done something right, something important. Students laughed in the hallways, played at recess, gossiped about crushes, and complained about homework. Life went on, but with a new undertone of awareness and purpose. One afternoon, Jamal overheard two sixth graders talking outside his classroom. One was explaining to the other why they had to stand up to a kid who was being mean to their classmate. "Mr. Hayes says that courage is contagious," the student said. "If we show it, other people will too." He hadn't actually said that, at least not in those exact words, but the message had gotten through anyway. His students were taking what they'd learned and making it their own, applying it to their daily lives in ways he hadn't anticipated. The physical signs of that Monday were fading. The news vans were long gone, the viral videos had been replaced by newer stories, and the hallway looked just like any other school hallway. But the invisible changes remained. In the way students carried themselves, in the discussions they chose to have, in the courage they showed in small ways every day. Each morning, when Jamal walked through the school doors, he felt the weight of what had happened. But he also felt something else: hope. These young people had shown him that the future could be different, that change was possible, that the lessons of history could come alive in the most unexpected moments.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.